The wind howled across the open plains like a wounded creature, dragging icy tendrils of snow across the frozen earth. The winter storm had rolled in without mercy, swallowing the land in a blanket of white so thick that even the moonlight vanished behind it. Out there, amidst the roaring wind and bitter cold, a lone figure struggled forward, a young woman, wrapped in a tattered coat that did little to guard her from the storm's teeth. Her name was Clara Whitmore, and she had been walking for hours. The storm had found her far from home, far from anywhere, really. Her small horse, frightened by thunder earlier that evening, had bolted into the woods, leaving her with only her satchel and the faint hope of finding shelter. Every step felt heavier than the last, her boots sinking into drifts up to her knees, her hands numb despite her attempts to rub life back into them. The snow kept coming, her breath puffed out in clouds, disappearing into the wind as quickly as it came. She could hardly see more than a few yards ahead when, through the white curtain, she spotted a flicker of orange and light, distant but steady. A lantern, a fire, whatever it was, it might mean warmth, or safety, or both. Driven by desperation, Clara forced her aching legs to move faster, stumbling through the snow toward that fragile promise of life. As she drew closer, the shape of a barn emerged. Large, old. Its roof bowed slightly under the weight of snow. The glow of a fire seeped through the cracks in the wooden planks. And for the first time all day, Clara felt something like hope. She reached the heavy barn doors and knocked, but the wind stole the sound away. So she pushed. The door creaked open just enough for her to peer inside. Warm light spilled out over her face and she gasped. A man was there, tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a brown duster coat with a Stetson hat tipped low. He stood beside a small fire pit, tending to a horse whose coat gleamed like polished chestnut in the firelight. The man turned at the sound of her entrance. His face was rugged, weathered by sun and wind, but his eyes, deep blue and calm as still water, carried something gentle within them. "You look half frozen," he said after a long pause, his voice steady but not unkind. "Come in before that storm swallows you whole." Clara hesitated at the threshold. I didn't mean to intrude. My horse ran off. I've been walking since sundown. I just needed a place to—" He raised a hand, silencing her apology. "You don't need to explain. Nobody deserves to be out there tonight." The warmth hit her like a wave as she stepped inside, closing the door against the shrieking wind. The fire crackled softly. The smell of hay, leather, and smoke filled the air. A few horses shifted in their stalls, curious about the new arrival. The man tossed another log onto the fire and gestured toward a wooden bench. "Sit. You'll thaw faster that way. There's coffee on the stove. It's not fancy, but it's hot." She sat, her limbs trembling as the warmth seeped slowly back into her bones. When she finally looked at him again, she realized how much the light softened his roughness. "My name's Clara," she said quietly. He nodded once. "Name's Eli Carter." There was a long silence between them, broken only by the wind outside and the pop of the fire. Clara watched him move with quiet confidence. The way he brushed the horse's mane, the way he set the coffee mug beside her with steady hands. He wasn't a man of many words, that much was clear, but every movement spoke of care, patience, and something she hadn't seen in a long time, decency. She wrapped her hands around the mug, savoring its warmth. "Thank you for letting me in. I stopped at a farmhouse earlier, but—" Her voice faltered. They wouldn't open the door. Eli's expression hardened for a moment. Some folks close their hearts when they should open them the most. She looked down. "I guess I can't blame them. Times are hard." He studied her for a moment. Hard times don't excuse cold hearts. The firelight danced between them, painting their faces in shades of amber and gold. Outside, the storm raged louder, rattling the barn walls. But inside there was stillness, fragile, yet comforting. Eli poured himself a cup and sat across from her. "Where were you headed before the storm hit?" "To town," she said. "My sister lives there. I was hoping to surprise her for Christmas." "Christmas," Eli echoed softly, as though the word belonged to another lifetime. "Haven't celebrated that in years." "Why not?" she asked. He shrugged, staring into the fire. "Not much reason to. My folks are gone. My brother moved east. Only thing left is this barn, a few horses, and the quiet." Clara smiled faintly. "The quiet isn't so bad." He looked up then, meeting her gaze. "No, I reckon it isn't." For a long time they sat in companionable silence. The snow outside muffled every sound, making the world feel smaller, just the two of them. the fire, and the storm's fading growl. When Eli finally spoke again, his voice was low. "You can stay here tonight. I've got blankets in the loft. It's warmer up there." "I don't want to trouble you." "It's no trouble," he said firmly. "The storm won't ease until morning." "You'd freeze before you made it a mile." Clara hesitated, but exhaustion won. She followed him to the ladder leading up to the loft, where hay bales were stacked high and a few wool blankets lay folded neatly. The space was cozy, smelling of cedar and hay, the kind of warmth that came from honest work and steady hands. "You can take my coat, too," Eli said, handing her his thick brown duster. She shook her head. "You'll freeze." He chuckled softly. "I'm used to it." "You're not." For the first time that night, she smiled, a small, grateful thing that melted the last bit of ice in her heart. "Thank you, Eli, truly." He tipped his hat slightly. "Get some rest. I'll keep the fire going." As she curled beneath the blankets, the exhaustion of the day caught up with her. The barn's warmth and the steady crackle of the fire lulled her into a fragile peace. Below, she could hear Eli humming softly, an old, wordless tune that drifted up through the rafters like a lullaby. Outside, the storm began to fade. The wind's howl softened to a whisper, and snow fell in gentler flakes, settling over the world like forgiveness. Before sleep claimed her, Clara looked down through the gaps in the hay. Eli sat by the fire, his hat resting on his knee, staring into the flames with a kind of quiet sorrow that made her heart ache. She didn't know his story, not yet, but she knew one thing for certain. The man who had opened his barn tonight had also opened his heart, even if he didn't realize it. And as the last of her fears melted away, Clara whispered a silent prayer of thanks, not just for shelter, but for kindness. When morning came, the first light of dawn would reveal a world remade in white. But neither Clara nor Eli could have guessed how that single act of compassion, one open door in a blizzard, would change both their lives forever. Morning crept softly over the plains, a pale light spilling across the horizon like a promise kept. The storm had spent itself in the night, leaving behind a world transformed, every fence post capped in white, every tree branch glittering with frost like crystal lace. Inside the old barn, the air was still warm from the fire that had burned through the night, its embers glowing softly in the hearth. Eli Carter stirred first, rising from his chair by the fire and stretching the stiffness from his limbs. He glanced up toward the loft where Clara slept, her figure wrapped in his coat and half buried in blankets. For a moment he just watched, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. She looked peaceful now, far removed from the trembling stranger who had staggered through his door only hours before. Something inside him eased, a quiet relief he hadn't known he needed. He'd lived alone for so long that the presence of another soul, especially one so kind and human, felt like a forgotten comfort. As the coffee boiled in the old tin pot, the smell drifted upward and stirred Clara awake. She blinked against the soft morning light streaming through the cracks in the wood, the sound of the horses shifting gently below her. For a moment she forgot where she was. Then she remembered the storm, the cold, and the man who had saved her from both. "Morning," Eli called up, his voice calm, almost musical in its roughness. "Coffee's on." "You hungry?" Clara pushed herself up, brushing hay from her coat with a smile. "Depends. You got anything besides coffee?" "Beans, bread, and some jerky if you're feeling brave," he replied with a grin. "That sounds like a feast after yesterday," she said, climbing down the ladder. Her boots hit the packed earth floor, and she felt the warmth of the fire against her cheeks again. The world outside might have been frozen solid, but in that barn, life moved with a quiet rhythm. The snort of horses, the crackle of firewood, the clatter of metal mugs. Eli poured her a cup and handed it over. "You sleep all right?" "Better than I expected," she said, wrapping her hands around the mug. "You kept the fire going all night?" "Someone had to," he said simply. "Didn't want you waking up in an icebox." She smiled. "Thank you again." He shrugged, looking away as if embarrassed. "Wasn't nothing." "You'd have done the same." Clara didn't answer right away. She studied him instead, the way his jaw tightened when he spoke, the quiet modesty that seemed to live in every motion. Eli Carter was a man who carried silence like a second skin. He wasn't cold, just careful. The kind of man who'd seen enough loss to know words could only reach so far. They shared breakfast in easy quiet, the kind that didn't need to be filled. When they finished, Clara pulled her coat tighter and peered out through the barn door. The sun hung low, glinting off the snow. It was beautiful and dangerous. The drifts were deep, and the road back to town still hidden beneath a foot of ice. "Reckon you'll have to wait another day or two before the road clears," Eli said, joining her at the doorway. "Snow that thick don't melt easy." She nodded slowly. "I can help around here if you'll let me." "I don't like feeling like a burden," he chuckled. "You're no burden, Clara, but if it'll make you feel better, you can feed the chickens." So she did. For the rest of the morning, they worked side by side, the kind of quiet labor that builds small bridges between people. Clara brushed the horses, laughing when one tried to nibble at her scarf, and Eli fixed a broken gate hinge, glancing over now and then with a faint amusement he didn't bother hiding. The sun climbed higher, melting the edges of icicles and sending soft, rivulets of water down the barn's roof. Life, as it always does, began to move again. Around midday, as they rested on a hay bale, Clara finally asked the question that had been hovering on her tongue since the night before. "You said last night you don't celebrate Christmas anymore. Why?" Eli's hand stilled. For a long moment he didn't answer. Then he sighed, a sound heavy enough to silence the air around them. "Used to, every year. My folks loved it. Ma would bake pies for half the county, and Pa would drag in a tree big enough to scrape the ceiling. When they passed, I kept it up for a while. But my wife, she didn't make it through the winter 4 years ago, pneumonia. Since then, I figured there wasn't much reason for lights or songs." Clara's heart twisted. "I'm sorry, Eli, I didn't know." He shook his head slowly. "No reason you should. We all carry our own winters, I suppose." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of understanding. Clara knew what it was to lose. Her father had died when she was young, her mother's health fading soon after. Loss had a way of carving people into shapes they didn't recognize. Maybe that's why she had walked through the snow the night before. Not just to reach her sister, but to prove that she could still move forward, even when life froze around her. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft. "Maybe Christmas isn't about having reason. Maybe it's about giving one to someone else." Eli looked at her then, really looked, as if the words had struck someplace deeper than she meant to reach. The light from the barn door framed her face, and for a fleeting moment, something shifted in him. Something small but undeniable. As the day faded, the two of them worked again, tending to the animals, stacking firewood, and sharing small stories in between. By evening, the world outside glowed blue and gold. The sky brushed with streaks of crimson. Eli lit a lantern and hung it by the barn door, its light flickering like a heartbeat against the snow. "Storm's over," Clara said quietly. "I should leave in the morning." He nodded, though his eyes fell to the ground. "You should. Your sister's probably worried sick." But neither of them moved to end the moment. They stood side by side, watching the horizon swallow the last of the sun. It was strange, Clara thought, how quickly a stranger could begin to feel like home. Later that night, when she climbed back to the loft, Eli returned to his chair by the fire. He thought of his wife, of the long winters he'd spent alone, and of the soft laughter that had returned to his barn that day, laughter he hadn't realized he'd missed until now. He looked up toward the loft where Clara slept, her soft breathing steady and peaceful, and he smiled to himself. Maybe the storm hadn't just brought her to his door. Maybe it had brought something back to him, too, something he'd thought buried forever. When dawn came again, the sky was clear, a soft blush of pink stretching across the plains. Eli had saddled a horse before Clara woke, its breath steaming in the cold morning air. When she stepped down from the loft, bundled and ready, he handed her a small bundle wrapped in cloth, bread, jerky, and a jar of honey. "You didn't have to," she began. "I know," he said gently, "but I wanted to." She looked at him, and in her eyes, he saw gratitude, kindness, and something wordless, the kind of feeling that doesn't need to be spoken to be known. "Thank you, Eli," she whispered, "for everything." He tipped his hat, a soft smile tugging at his lips. "Safe travels, Miss Whitmore. You take care of that heart of yours." Clara swung into the saddle and turned toward the road, snow crunching beneath the horse's hooves. She rode a few yards before stopping, glancing back one last time. Eli stood by the barn door, framed by sunlight, the warmth of the fire behind him. He raised a hand in farewell, and she returned it with a smile that reached her eyes. As she rode away, the wind carried the faint sound of church bells. From the distant town, Christmas morning after all. And though Eli was alone again, the barn didn't feel empty anymore. It felt alive, like something good had been left behind. Hope, maybe, or faith, or simply the echo of kindness freely given. That night, as he sat by the fire once more, Eli found himself reaching for a small wooden box buried in the corner. Inside was an old ornament, a star, carved by his father's hand. He hung it by the fire, its edges catching the flicker of flame. For the first time in years, he whispered a simple prayer of thanks, not for what he had lost, but for what had found him. Because sometimes the greatest miracles don't arrive with trumpets or lights. Sometimes they come in the shape of a knock on a barn door, and a stranger shivering in the snow,